Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Futureverse, brought to you by IntelligenceSquared and Ytree. I'm Kamal Ahmed. Ytree was founded in 2017 to give its clients the transparency, efficiency, and meaning they need to fully understand their financial lives, as they are and as they could be. This is the final episode in our latest mini-series, in which we've been digging into what it means to be truly successful. And today, we want to get practical. What are the tools and insights that we can use to build happy and healthy lives? To help me out, I'm joined by two leading experts in this field from two different disciplines, a designer and an economist. A mechanical engineer by training, Dave Evans teaches the popular Designing Your Life courses at Stanford and is the co-author of the New York Times bestseller, Designing Your Life: How to Build a Well-Lived, Joyful Life. Dr. Grace Lordan is an associate professor at the London School of Economics and the author of Think Big, Take Small Steps, and Build the Future You Want. She's also the inaugural director of the Behavioural Science MSc at the LSE and has served as an expert advisor to the UK government, sitting on their Skills and Productivity Board. Grace and Dave, welcome to the podcast.
Delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Brilliant. We're going to have a lovely period of time together, but let's just go a little bit into backgrounds for you both. Grace, could I come to you first? Could you share for us all a bit about your background and how you arrived in this brilliant position where your expertise is now in advising people on their own lives?
Yeah, so I became quite interested in studying productivity from the perspective of firms. So I spent a lot of time looking at teams and what makes teams work better together with respect to being more productive. And from that, I used to get invited to give talks in big companies about productivity from the perspective of the firm, but also why we had these gaps between men and women when it came to pay and promotions. And very often the type of things that I would be describing that people could change would be done at the team level. So you would need a manager who was bought in, or who would be done at the firm level. So the firm would have to have kind of really big changes. And usually after the talk, somebody would come up to me. And you have to understand that when you give a talk to a big organization, the people who show up, there is a selection bias. They tend to be younger, they tend to have slightly more time, and they tend to have less power in the organizations. And people would come up to me and say, you know, your talk was interesting. Behavioral science is interesting, but actually everything you pointed out was things that's beyond my control. What can I do for me? So I took this really seriously. You know, there were so many people kind of said it to me over time, and I thought it would be really nice for me to do some research on the area of how people can propel their own success and what success means to them, but also bring together the large literature that was already there in behavioral science. So that's what kind of brought me to writing Think Big, Take Small Steps, and Build the Future That You Want, which I hope helps people who are stuck in the wrong career, stagnated in their career, or in some other way want to actually change what they're doing in life, get to where they want to go to.
Thanks so much, Grace. Dave, could I come to you? Just a bit of your background. Now, we were joking slightly before we started this recording. Yeah. I'm doing this recording on a Macintosh, and you have at least a slight role in the birth of this amazing product. But just start there and then take us through to how you ended up in this amazing position you now find yourself.
Yeah, it's a very strange job to have, talking to people about designing their lives. No, I spent 35 years in Silicon Valley and high tech stuff, which I fell into pretty accidentally because I couldn't make a living working on advanced energy technology, which is what my degrees were in 1976. And those degrees did not come with a brochure that informed you, oh, by the way, this thing we've just taught you how to do, nobody will do or care about for the next 37 years. That was not in the brochure. So I had to reinvent myself, and I fell into, it's a long, silly story, I fell into Apple in the early days and was the world's first mouse product manager in 1979 before most of your listeners were born. So that's where I go back to actually the Lisa computer, which preceded Macintosh. So go way back in tech, and then went off and did lots of other things with people building products. But I was on that very first Apple corporate culture committee with Steve Jobs in 1980. The first year I was at Apple, we grew from 800 to 5,000 people. So that's pretty fast. And about every busloads of people arriving daily. And there was sort of this terrorized fear that, oh my God, I mean, all these people from, National Semiconductor and Hewlett Packard are arriving at Apple, and we're going to suddenly be overtaken. by these other people who don't get it? And how do we sustain what makes Apple Apple while all these otherly thinking people suddenly arrive? And so we formed a corporate culture committee before there was such a thing as corporate culture. And what I noticed in that work was everybody cared about their lives. I mean, I was, in my late 20s, early 30s, deeply struggling with trying to figure out how to do Dave authentically in the work world, the kind of things that Grace was mentioning. And everybody else was too. So that's been on my mind on the side. Corporate culture, how do we create not just cool products, but cool places to work where people can be their real selves in some kind of meaningful way, as well as, get the job done. And that's a difficult brew. That turned into an invitation to teach at Cal Berkeley in 1999. And then my buddy Bill Burnett started this thing at Stanford. I said, hey, why don't we hang out? That was 2007. And then, we started teaching a class and off you go. Then we wrote a book and everybody bought it. And then I got to talk to you. So that's, I don't know how
Dave, this is obviously the highlight of this journey, as well as speaking to Steve Jobs. You've now spoken to Kamal Ahmed. So that's the two giants.
The bookends of my life is Steve and Kamal.
So, Dave, talk to me about what is life design? What is it? How does it work? And what are the principles?
Okay, well, very briefly, without trying to do a semester in a minute. So in the world of design, by the way, there are largely two completely different categories of design, which I describe as, design thinking or design innovation, and then there's craft design. The word design, if you just use it by itself, most people rightly think about graphic design, ergonomic design, furniture design, car design. The people who make cars look cool. Those are the designers, and that design has been around since before Da Vinci. And it's a wonderful field, and it's not what we teach at Stanford. What we teach at Stanford is formerly known as HCD, Human-Centered Design, started in 1963, the oldest interdisciplinary program at the university integrating engineering, art, and psychology. And so we've been teaching people, and we started out teaching people how to innovate solutions to wicked problems that turn into appropriate new products. So product design is a methodology, not a craft skill. David Kelly renamed it design thinking about 15 years ago. And that sort of stuck. So it's a different way of thinking. And that way of thinking boils down essentially to prototype iterations. So have a bunch of really cool ideas, then prototype your way forward, because we know we don't know what we're doing. We're doing something we've never done before. We're inventing this place to go no one's ever been before called the future. And so you can't analyze it. You can't think it. You can't engineer it. You have to actually empirically try it. So it's a trial and error process, very compatible with Grace's approach to take small steps. One of our colleagues in the design group, BJ Fogg, who's a behavioralist, Grace you probably know, wrote a book called Tiny Habits. So we're all about set the bar low and clear it, which means prototype iteration. So we teach people how to apply these design approaches to designing not a product, but their lives. And so, we can help people sort of sneak up on their future by doing this empirical process of innovation.
Dave, can you give me or help our audience, our listeners, with a practical example of that tiny step that I could think about in my life? Maybe.
Sure. Let's say I'm thinking. First of all, we got asked once on one of these live interviews. Can you summarize the book in a sentence? And you said, "Well, gosh, that's kind of
typical
hard.
Journalist."
Yeah, but we came up with 4 sentences, but it's only 10 words. And so the posted version of the entire book is: get curious, talk to people, try stuff, tell your story. So if you do those 4 things and understand how they interrelate, you're good to go. You can skip the 232 pages or whatever it is. And an example would be, gosh, I'm in my career and I'm doing finance and I'm pretty bored. I think I want to do marketing and I know what I need to do. I need to stop out. I need to get an MBA at night. I need to go to the LSE, where Grace teaches. In fact, I've got one of my mentees who's just flown to London and he can't find housing. He's at the LSE and he's making himself crazy, which is a very, very impactful thing to do. It's expensive, it's long, it's hard. And then you finish that master's degree and then you do job interviewing and then you get your first 6 months and you go, this is what marketing really is? I don't like this very much at all. Okay, that's a really good example of not doing life design. It's the way a lot of people would make a strategic decision and have you committed and are you all in? And it's a terrible approach. And so we would say, look, if you were going to prototype that, you'd go, have coffee with a bunch of people who not only were working in marketing, but had made the shift to marketing from some other field, and what they learned about what was different and how did they handled their misperceptions and what were they surprised by, and then try to get some guy in marketing to maybe the company you're working in now, go find some reason why your finance function deserves to have an intersection with their marketing people and do a little ride along, sit in on their staff meeting, go get some experience. So do this experiential thing, we call that life prototyping, in order to get, as Dan Gilbert would say, from a research point of view, surrogation input, not simulation input. Simulation, read a bunch of stuff and think in your head what you think it might be like. That means you're simulating reality, which very often is a lousy way to make a decision, as opposed to go out and talk to real people and have real experiences, which is surrogating reality. And that actually gives your discernment capacity in your brain better information.
Now, just before I come back to you, Grace, can you explain to us, Dave, the difference between a design problem and an engineering problem?
Yes. So there's lots of ways to think. If I just compare engineering thinking with design thinking, and I have 2 degrees in engineering, the design program is in the engineering school, but engineers work on tame problems. That's a technical term developed by urban planners at Berkeley back in the 70s. And a tame problem is well-bounded, it's understood, there are actual solutions to it. And when you solve a tame problem, that solution is repeatable and reliable. You build a bridge, civil engineer builds a bridge and understands strength and all that stuff. And if I move that bridge from England to the middle of the Arizona desert, like we did many years ago, it'll work fine. It'll look stupid, but it'll look fine. It'll work fine. That's an engineering problem where you solve your way forward. In a design problem, those are wicked problems. A wicked problem is I don't know what I'm looking for until I find it. Once I find it, I can't repeat it because it's totally context sensitive, like your life. There's not another Grace, so the Grace solution doesn't work for Kamal, and it keeps changing in real time. So those are wicked problems, and you can't solve those with equations because you don't have enough information. You have to iterate them experientially, and that's what design can help you do. It's really like improv in theater, and life is an improv skit. It's a long-running improv skit. We're doing improv training for people in life design.
Thank you, Dave. Grace, explain to me in the same way as some people who may not understand, behavioral science. How does behavioral science, which is a really growing discipline, I was formerly the economics editor of BBC, and one thing there was behavioral economics. And this notion of behavioral science, how does that help us understand human decision-making?
So I think, a very easy way to think about behavioral science is just that it is the study of human behavior. And it's a really important area of study because very often human beings make plans to do particular things and they'll declare boldly that they're going to make a change in a particular direction. And they, in fact, will fail at that. And they will repeatedly declare that they're going to do something and they just don't show up for themselves. So that intent-action gap is one big area of study within behavioral science. I think if you came to the LSE, one of the first things we talk about with students is Ode to Danny Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize, and his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. I couldn't recommend it more highly, but that there's 2 different thinking styles. So one, very, very fast, you're on autopilot, it's habit-driven. The other is very, very slow and very, very deliberate. And I think what's fascinating about these 2 thinking styles is that the best evidence that we have suggests that we spend about 80 to 95% of our waking hours actually in this habit-driven mode. So when you think about your career, I guess you want to think about 2 things. And when you think about success, you want to think about 2 things. First, how do you define where you want to go? And I really like what Dave has just said, the idea of kind of trial and error. So there's a bunch of tasks that make out jobs out in the world, and you go and start trying them. And how will you know what to try? Well, you talk to people who've already forged that path. And then I guess the second thing is, given that we know people don't really regularly show up for themselves, how do we get them to do this very, very regularly and very, very routinely? So how do we get them to take these small steps? And I think behavioral science has a lot of insights in that regard about how the biases that are more likely to kind of circumvent you from getting to where you want to go, and how you as an individual can strategize to make sure that you actually do show up for yourself and don't end up, sitting in front of Netflix for an evening when you're planning on going out networking and meeting some people about your new career, or doing other things that might give you some joy in the moment, but don't really help your future self so much.
And Grace, again, as I said to Dave, can you make this practical for us? What would be some actual real life examples of how this method really that Dave and you are both putting forward for how to think about the future of our lives, particularly in the workplace, how practically that might be revealed?
So I think thinking about jobs as bundles of tasks is a very effective way to go forward. So rather than thinking of yourself, I want to be a lawyer, I want to be a marketer, I want to be an accountant, think about what are the things that you enjoy doing that absolutely give you flow in that particular moment. And I think until you've nailed down, these are 10 tasks that I absolutely love and I really enjoy doing them, and I want to get a job that will allow me to do those 10 tasks as much as possible. Keeping your options open is a really kind of good way to go forward. And I couldn't agree with Dave more. If you're not 100% sure about what your passion is, going and doing a degree that's very, very costly and that's going to give you debt, given that we kind of have democratized education now and you can find skills online and you can find lots of really excellent public events to go to, isn't a wise choice. So, for example, if you realize that you enjoy coding, if you realize that you enjoy public speaking, if you realize that you enjoy kind of creating events, putting yourself in situations where you're with people who do that for a living, but also how you also get to practice. And I think a practical tip for people who are listening is that you should be doing that at least 90 minutes a week. So really kind of saying there's a minimum threshold that I'm going to show up for my future self, and it's 90 minutes a week. And the reason that I put that as so low is that this is kind of the minimum time that's been shown to be effective in investing yourself that leads to compounding effects. But also there's going to be listeners who'll say, well, I have caring responsibilities. I have to work to pay the mortgage. I have to do. And they will always be constraints to stand in your way. But everybody can carve out 90 minutes in the week to show up for themselves, to kind of move them towards a different future. And I think if you're not doing that right now, it's really important that you get started.
Grace, you said at the top of the this podcast that lots of people maybe don't feel empowered to have this approach and don't have this they don't have the ability to take this autonomy in their workplace. What do you say to people who say, well, yeah, that's all very well, but actually I've got to apply for a certain job and then I've just got to apply myself to that job? Are there ways that you can think about that if you are more junior in a team, for example?
I mean, I think anything that says that I have to do something, people should be questioning it. So there's always going to be a subset of people out there who say, look, this isn't for me. I'm not interested in blue sky thinking. There's one thing that I have to do, and I'm going to get on with it. And maybe that isn't the audience for my book, Think Big. I think who I'm trying to speak to are people who know that they're sitting in the wrong job, who know that they're not going fast enough, who know that they haven't necessarily found their passion. And for them, visualizing their future selves is a really good way to get motivated. So I think most of us and most of your listeners will be engaged in their community in some way or engage with their colleagues in some way that you take care of other people. So you pay it forward, you pay it backwards, and you really look out for other people. Much less of us actually look out for our future selves in the same way and give ourselves the same time. So I like to visualize my future self as kind of a community of people and thinking about, when Grace is 40 years of age, is she going to be taken care of when she's 50, when she's 60, when she's 70? And what am I actually doing now that sets them up for success? And what am I doing now that sets my current self up for success? And again, I think that can be a really good motivator. If you can and I'm really excited about AI movements in this, where you can generate your future selves because it makes everything much easier. But if you can visualize where you want your future self to be and what they'll actually be doing, it's a really good motivator to get you going for that 90 minutes a week, which really is a very short amount of time.
And Grace, just before I come back to you, Dave, tell us about Me Plus, which is the first chapter of your book. Just widen that out for us and explain what Me Plus means.
So your Me Plus is the person who you want to be if it all works out. Usually when we think about the future, people put lots of different constraints on it. So I can't travel to get to where I need to go. There's too many things that I have to do in my life. I'm just too constrained. So I ask people to do kind of this blue sky thinking and think, what if it all worked out? And instead of blue sky thinking, as we've already said, with labels, really in line with what Dave has said, when you're designing your life, you're thinking about how are you actually going to be spending your time? What are the tasks that you're going to be actually doing? And in doing that, you create this vision of Me Plus, who is your community of future selves. And just by simply visualizing in that way and imagining who you'll be in 5 years, again, is a good way to kind of remind yourself what you're actually doing when you show up for that 90 minutes every week.
Can I jump in and just agree with Grace and add on to that?
Yes, please.
Okay. So one thing we find a lot is particularly with young people, early career people, particularly if they feel like they're stuck in a job and they're overwhelmed by the tasks, is I'm trying to get it right. This isn't it. It's got to be over there. I'm in the wrong place. And so I need to make this big move. In our second book, Designing Your New Work Life, we talk about the best person to get a better job from is you. Don't resign, redesign. So it may well be that you need to make a shift. Okay, that's fine. But our recommendation is start small and actually recognize that in every job, if we're talking about making my life better in the job I'm in now, there's the stuff, there are, must-haves, nice-to-haves. Get really smart, game the system. Understand what it is the organization needs from you. Understand why they need it from you. They wanted to hire a midfielder, and you want to play goalie. Well, that's great, but we need a midfielder. So get your midfielding done. Get whatever your assignment is figured out, and then recognize there's lots of room around the side where you can make incremental changes. What we call sort of 4 strategies for modifying your job. Level 1 is to just re-enlist, tell the story you're telling yourself, a different story, a different narrative that allows you to have a different experience of meaning making and satisfaction. That's literally just changing your story. That can be profoundly effective. The second one, my favorite, is remodeling. I can make minor changes. I can hang up a new piece of artwork. I can move the furniture around. I can change the way I do my reports. I can, do one-on-one conversations with my team members, not necessarily a staff meeting. I can make minor structural changes that correspond to how I work and really satisfactory to me. I can relocate. I can maybe jump departments or what have you within an organization that already trusts me, or all the way up to reinvent myself, which might mean more training and a more expensive, difficult shift. But boy, there are a couple of pretty cheap, easy to move, and 2 out of 4 processes that don't even require your boss's approval. By the way, most organizations don't mind getting more value for free. They're already paying you. And if you did something that was valuable to them and interesting to you on top of your current job, I'm saying work more, then your satisfaction goes way up. One thing we tell people a lot is don't conflate a significant psychic dividend with a small time change. And Grace might think about this from a behavioral science point of view. It's surprising if I just had a little more one-on-one interactivity. It turns out one-on-one interactivity really floats my boat. Great. So you come in 20 minutes early, 2 days a week, and have coffee with one of your team members and ask an incredibly penetrating question like, so how's it going? No, how's it really going? And then you have this actual authentic conversation twice a week for 20 minutes, and all that meant was that you took one train sooner those 2 days a week, and in your experience the entire week can shift. So give yourself a chance to get the most out of the life you're in. You don't always have to make a big change or cram a bunch of new stuff in. Most people are leaving tons of value on the table in the life that's in front of them right now.
I love that. I love the idea of job crafting. So you're in a role, and let's try to start moving slowly towards tasks that I actually love, while still doing some of the things that I enjoy less.
And most people haven't the faintest idea what they like or what they're actually good at.
Yeah.
They misinterpret themselves all the time. One of my favorite examples, a young man I know, he's actually in the book, he's renamed, his real name is Morgan. He was a civil engineer, came out of school, went to work, got into a small architecture firm, theoretically a great situation. A year into it, he's incredibly unhappy. I meet him and he's just about to shift over to becoming a stockbroker. Oh, his father-in-law happens to be a stockbroker. Oh, there's a little insight. Okay. And because, apparently I don't like being a civil engineer, I kind of go, whoa. I don't think you know anything at all about what you like and dislike. You're 2 years out of college. Here's what you got to do. We call it the Good Time Journal. The Good Time Journal is you just log. You do not make any changes. This is very difficult to do, by the way. Objectively observe yourself without modifying your behavior. Grace may have some comments on how to do that. When you're self-managing, you got to know yourself. Step 1 in design is empathy, and the first person to be empathetic for is yourself. What am I really like? So, Morgan tracks, what did I do today? What did I like? Where was my energy? You talk about this, and then it turns out, guess what? He loves civil engineering. He hates administration. He hates client management. He hates, being on team. He actually hates being on teams. Like, please lock me in a windowless room with a screen and a quadrille pad and a pencil and hard problems. Oh, I'm so happy. So it turns out, so it actually goes back to get a PhD and work on really hard problems in an analytic firm, because that's what he really wants to do. He's a super engineer. He's not a bad engineer. He's a super engineer. Just shouldn't have anything to do with customers. So learning who you really are, step one. And then step two, how could that, what I really like doing, express itself in my current job in a way that is compatible with my bosses and my colleagues rather than incompatible, which is an easy mistake to make. I'll start doing the stuff I like that they never asked for or they don't care about. That's going to fail. That happens all the time. Get smart and get happier.
I think that learning about yourself, Dave, as well, it mightn't even be binary. So if you start like writing down your mood, when you're doing different activities, you might realize, okay, I like public speaking and I like networking sometimes, but if I have too much of that, my week goes entirely off. And you get, so learning, the kind of mix of activities that ultimately will make you happy, like your colleague Morgan, means that you can actually choose a job that works best for you.
Dave, one of the big themes in your book is that there is no one right you. This notion of I have one thing I want to do or a singular purpose.
Passion. Yeah.
Just elaborate on that.
It's probably our central dysfunctional belief. We talk a lot about dysfunctional beliefs. That's a psychological term for ideas that are popular and either at least ungenerative or in many cases just flat out untrue. And so like, I need to find my passion. So what is your passion? That's the driving question. We got to rep as the anti-passion guys now, which is unfair. We love passion. We just dislove the dysfunctional belief of it. And so let's just take that question. What's your passion? Okay, that question believes things. The research shows 8 out of 10 people answer that question. Gosh, I don't know, Dave, I haven't found mine yet. Or I've got a bunch. Which one did you want to hear about first? Now, either of those people who represent what's called completely normal human beings are not directed, do not have the directivity of a singular passion, and they think something is wrong with them. That question believes, number 1, everybody has a passion. Number 2, it's singular. Number 3, it can be turned into a career. Number 4, you'll know it early in life before you've even done it. And number 5, the world's going to let you make a living doing it. And guess what? All 5 of those are false. Not one of those is true. So be very careful which questions you decide to authorize to judge your life. All right. And what's your passion is a lousy question to judge your life. Our conviction is, and our observation both scientifically and empirically is but our anecdote pile is like in the tens of thousands now. Every one of us contains more aliveness than one lifetime will permit you to express, i.e. there's more than one of you in there. So there is no one right you, we argue. There are many good yous. So we, in fact, I just give a big talk to a large university on why don't try to find your purpose, because that implies there's one. Do live purposefully. I mean, like, what are you doing and why? You want a really good answer to that that's consistent with who you are as a human being, but like, that's it. That's my single purpose. That singularity, that exclusivity idea, my one snowflake version of life, is an incredibly attractive idea. Frankly, it's a reasonably arrogant one. I am so utterly unique. There's only one thing that the universe wants from me, and I've been put here to do that one thing, and the whole world is organized around me. Frankly, it's a little egocentric. Like, dude or dudette, there's 8 billion people here. All we really want from you is something interesting that's alive making, as Joseph Campbell might say, and is contributory. And if you're on your way toward that and you're growing as a human being, you're doing a great job. So lighten up, relax a little bit. You're never going to get fulfilled. If fulfilled means all of you is happening, you're way too big to have all of you happening.
Now, Dave, give me an example where this has helped you. And I'm going to come to you as well, Grace. I think this is really fascinating, this conversation. But Dave, give me an example where some different yous appeared and helped you make a decision.
Well, I'm looking at one right now. So, I mean, a couple of months ago, I turned 70. I'm 70 freaking years old, Sadly, I was, successfully, but rather unhappily married for 24 years as a young man, and then very amicably got divorced. Just had dinner with my ex-wife. Then was very happily married for 20 years to a wonderful woman that I buried 3 years ago because she got cancer again. We agreed she wasn't going to do that, and she went off and did it, and she died on me. And, at the age of 70, which was sad but not tragic, she had a wonderful life. and now I have chances are I'm going to die having been married 3 times. I never would have thought that's true when I was 20. So I'm 70 years old. I have 11 grandchildren, and I've done all this stuff. I've had 5 careers. I've got some choices in front of me. So my next milestone is death. Death is my next big milestone. And so what do I do? So I could be the education reformer, run over to LSE, hang out with Grace. Run around the world, do this education reform thing. We don't talk about this enough with young people. We should change education back to adult formation. Go for it, Dave. Change the planet before you die. Thing number 1. Thing number 2, I've got 11 grandkids. My father killed himself when I was 9. I didn't have a dad growing up. I was a pretty good dad. I could be a world-class grandfather if I just decided to invest deeply in these 11 lives. That is a career, ladies and gentlemen. And by the way, they're pretty neat kids and they all like me. Or I could go off and just, the heck with you guys. I gave my goods. I've sold 1 million books. What do you want from me? I'm going to get my bareboat captain, certification, go down to the Caribbean and sail catamarans. The hell are you people? I'm done now. Now those are pretty different people, and those are legitimate choices I actually can make. Can't do all 3 at the same time.
And Dave, how is your system, or how could your system help you make good choices given those amazing opportunities you have ahead of you?
Well, first, it starts with all 3 of them are viable expressions of who Dave is. I could literally do any one of those 3 people. And if I lived into them well, including both the opportunities and accepting the constraints, we could generate a happy person there. But they're happy very, very different ways. So I actually have an exercise where you write a letter back to your present self. You assume 5 or 10 years from now, you lived that life. You imaginally become that future person, in 2033. And he writes a letter back to you and says what that life was like. And then you listen to those guys and decide which one of those memories would you like to actually experience. And it's not better or worse. There's not a right answer, like the real one shimmers and the other ones fade away. Sometimes that occurs, that's great. But if you're really lucky, it's an impossibly hard decision. And then you have to accept it's not about having everything. It's about having worthwhile things. And as my mentor would say to me at this point, so Dave, how's the coffee? Is the coffee good? We're having a great moment. So the first thing is to free you to be in the present moment as a fully alive person. That is as good as it gets. Having it all is a complete myth.
Grace.
I'm just sitting here. I think Dave should do all 3. I think he should say 3 years. I'm going to do 3 years of education, 3 years with the grandkids, and then I'm off to the beach. They can visit me if they want. I'll have these amazing relationships. They're welcome.
Okay.
They're welcome anytime. I think you can do all 3. It's similar, Kamal. It really is. So I think that there isn't kind of one passion that I've had in my career that has kind of driven what I'm doing. And as I kind of go through my career, I would describe what I do now as a portfolio career. So I'm a very traditional academic. I do need to do good quality research. So that's absolutely something that I do, kind of the core of my tasks. But the things that give me joy in the spirit of how Dave spoke about them is often the impact that comes from the research. So talking to policymakers, talking to firms about what it actually means for them. So that's another strand of work that I've started doing. I've started doing more public speaking. I'm creating a podcast. So kind of creating this portfolio of tasks that go around my core career for me has been incredibly valuable. And unlike Dave, where he has kind of 3 big things to choose from, all of these are possible with some kind of crafty time balancing. And I think for people who are listening who do feel torn in a number of directions, maybe having a portfolio career is something that you can look into. It doesn't need to be one thing that you do to generate income. And also actually doing multiple things can be something that brings joy to people as well, depending on their personality.
And Grace, let's talk about the few of the words, the descriptors that are used in behavioral science, which is Pygmalion effect, confirmation bias, omission versus action bias. Can you just take us through some of that terminology and how that can help us think more cleverly about our futures?
Well, I mean, one thing that I say to people who really have no idea where they want to go is that they should get themselves a diverse boardroom. So they should surround themselves with people who are quite different for themselves, and really try to leverage their advice. And the reason that I say that is because of confirmation bias. So as individuals, we tend to seek out people who think exactly the same as ourselves. We definitely don't like being challenged. And I think actually as society has gone on, that's happening more and more. You can just go onto social media and see polarization. And I think when it comes to you as an individual, never mind resolving society's problems, but you as an individual, one of the best gifts you can give to yourself is get the perspectives of individuals who are very different to what's actually going on in your life. And if you get people who are the right people, two things happen. You get the great advice, so you kind of overcome your confirmation bias. But all these other biases like availability bias, familiarity bias, start being challenged by this diverse network. And what's even more fantastic is very often they'll give you opportunities that you would not necessarily have had yourself. And you've mentioned the Pygmalion effect, which is one of my favorite studies, where these researchers went into a US school, back in the 60s, and they pointed out the high ability kids and they left. And they, when they went back, your listeners mightn't be surprised that the high ability kids were the ones who were thriving the most, until I tell you that the high ability kids were just randomly selected. The researchers had no clue as to who was high ability and who was low ability. And the reason we explain that is about belief. So if you have people, your diverse boardroom, who believe in you, you'll start rising to the occasion. So if people are suffering from kind of lower self-confidence, imposter syndrome, all these things that are stopping them getting going, and they can't self-motivate, just putting yourself in front of people who are diverse and critical, I think that second part is really important. You don't want people who are going to hug you and tell you you're right in every situation. You want people who will be critical and kind of push you forward. That's going to give you the Pygmalion effect, which really is, if you suffer from self-belief, one of the biggest gifts you can give to yourself.
Dave, I love this terminology. I think it really helps people think. Dave, you've talked about prototyping. Let's add that to the nice big soup of terms that we're using here.
So yeah, prototyping really is the cardiopulmonary system of design thinking. It's the essence of what it's all about. When you don't know what we talk about wayfinding versus navigation. I'll give you another couple of terms. So navigation technically means I know exactly where I am. I know where I'm going. I have data about the spaces in between. I can create an optimized path, which would be a straight line if at all possible. And that's what your GPS does. And because we're surrounded by technology all the time, we think we can navigate anything. I mean, we can solve it. Wayfinding is when I kind of know where I am. I definitely don't know where I'm going. And I have no data about the space in between. So now what do you do? Well, you make one move and you stop and you reflect and you look around and you get some feedback and you make another move. Then you make another move and you back up a little bit because you didn't make a mistake. You just learn something you didn't know. And then you take this very circuitous apparent path and end up in this other place. Now, again, for those watching on video, here's the critical thing. In wayfinding, this path, jumping all over the place and circling around and finally landing that place you didn't know you were going to until you got there, is the shortest distance between those two paths. In mortal time, that totally nonlinear path is the shortest possible distance. In an empirically discovery-oriented process called wayfinding. And so when you wayfind, prototyping is a technique to go out and have conversations and experiences that ask an interesting question to give you some feedback on the next step you're going to make. So an engineering prototype asks the question, did it work? Does this new jet engine work well enough when you throw a goose through it that we can put it on a plane full of people? That asks the question, does it work right yet? Not a design prototype. A design prototype kind of goes like, oh, I wonder if I sort of like running meetings. I wonder if I'd actually enjoy talking to like 50 people at once doing this public speaking thing. Can I go try a prototype of that? That's a feedback loop on an experience I've never had before. I can't analyze that question. I got to go try it. And so prototyping is about try something for the purpose of learning something, not, oh, I just took a new job as a public speaker and now I've got everything betting on it. That's a way too big a risk. So a prototype is a low risk experience or conversation that asks an interesting question about something you'd like to learn more about. Then you iterate those and then finally go, hey, I think I'll actually take that speaking gig.
Now, we've talked about popular ideas that might be bad ideas. Now, goal setting, that's often used in thinking about your future, thinking about the management of the futures of other people. Grace, can I come to you first? Is goal setting productive or counterproductive?
So I'm in the middle So there's people who really like goal setting. You should stick to your goal. You need to go for it. And there's people who say, don't, you should navigate your way around. I think setting a goal gets you off the starting blocks, but you should be ready to change direction. So, you might say, I'm driving to San Francisco, and along the way you decide to go a different course, and that's absolutely fine. And I think for people who suffer from procrastination and who suffer basically from being a little bit stagnant, saying that they're aiming for something that's lofty, that's blue sky, that's kind of, something to aim for is enough to get them having those conversations with the people, Dave and I have been talking about, where they learn about the tasks that they do. They start trying out what those people are doing, and they say, no, that's not for me. But if I pivot slightly, now I'm moving towards something, and then they change the goal again. So I like the idea that people have at least a medium-term goal that they're aiming for, but it needs to be something that can be changed as they discover their own preferences along the way.
Now, Dave, are you going to talk about goals setting with a plural behind it, or do you not like the whole terminology of that?
It's radioactive territory, and people have deep convictions about, almost religious convictions. But there's an end of the coaching world, and we bump into the coaching world a lot, that's really into this aspirational goal setting and huge accountability stuff. And frankly, that stuff makes me nuts. I think it mostly is beating souls to death. So I'm a big advocate of what I call stacked objectives, plural. One of my older sisters is an educator, often working with people who are doing a second career pivot into education. And she carefully reminds them, watch out for setting a life goal, the outcome of which is entirely in the hands of people who are not you. Your chance at satisfaction wants to be something more in your own control. And so a stacked objective for me, example would be when Bill and I started what became the Life Design Lab, 4 or 5 stacks. Number one, like, if we're lucky, we might actually help a couple of kids at Stanford. That's goal number 1. Goal number 2, and if we do that job well and a bunch of kids liked it, then maybe students will tell each other, and they start believing in student culture, we deserve help from the university, not only about how to learn things, but about how to figure out what to do with what we learned. Maybe that should be something students ask for. And if that goes well, maybe the administration would notice they're all whining about that. And then maybe Stanford University would say, hey, maybe we ought to actually incorporate this into the way we do student orientation and student development. And then if that gets some traction, maybe the educational world kind of goes, hey, maybe we ought to come back to adult formation as part of the university's job, not just information, maybe because they used to do it 200 years ago. They don't do it anymore. So can we come back to adult formation as part of our job? And we can do that in a value-independent way. We can do that in an inclusive way without being prescriptive. There's a way to pull that off. That'd be great. And then society at large kind of goes, oh, we've been misperceiving what young adults are about for the last 150 years. We need to think differently about what it means to become a person. So I want to go all the way from a couple of kids at Stanford had a good time up to I'm repositioning anthropological perception of the existential purpose of human beings on the planet forever. So, give yourself a shot. So have an aspiration out there, but a couple of steps along the way so you're not screwed if you don't hit the mark.
There's quite a few steps between those two things, Dave, but thank you so much for laying out ambition and also small steps at the beginning. Now, big scary word, failure. Grace, I'm going to come to you first. How do we think about failure? And Grace, I'm just going to say, we've heard a lot of people saying failure should be treated as a success. It's part of your life's journey. So I get that bit of it, but I imagine that you might have an even cleverer take on what failure even is.
I mean, I think if I had my way, I would ban the word failure when it comes to thinking about career progression. And people say you should fail fast, you should experiment fast. So try and learn as much as you can. And that really is all failure is. When we think about labeling things, success versus failure, we imagine that there's this kind of binary world where everything's within our control. And if we put in enough effort, we'll get to succeed. And if we don't, we get to fail. And that's not true. So rather than failing fast, we should experiment fast. But I think equally when we succeed, we should be doing postmortems and asking ourselves, why did I succeed in this situation? Did I just get lucky, or was it something specific that I actually did that allowed me to realize this success? So you can double down on that. And I would do the same for failures, and I actively do that for myself. When things don't work out, I'll say, okay, this didn't work out this time. Was it down to me, or was it just down to some luck or some other factors outside my control? And if it was down to me, it's something that I can learn from and kind of move on. If it's down to luck, I've learned to dust myself off and move on. And I hope your listeners can as well. I know that when we anticipate failure even more than experiencing failure itself, it can hold people back, because there's some evidence in the literature, and there's kind of more people studying this at the moment, that the physical effects that you have when you anticipate and you think about failure are much larger than actually going through the failure itself, because people are beautifully resilient. So for me, for people listening, I wouldn't just question what your attitude to failure is. I would also probe yourself if what's keeping you stuck is anticipating failure and never getting off those starting blocks.
Now, Dave, similar question. Failure, good or bad word? How do we think about it?
It comes up a lot, and we're large because in the design world, we're famous for saying, you want to attain failure immunity. Very much that fail fast to succeed sooner thing, which is true, but that's actually couched very specifically in that a prototype's job is to learn something. So of course it's going to fail. You never wanted your prototype to become the outcome. It was, I'm just going to go try to learn something, and if I break it, that's fine. Now that idea of failure immunity has gotten so popular that I think we've done people a disservice. So go do a bunch of design prototypes and try things and fail a lot. Go, yeah, I think I really do. I really want to become a marketing guy. And off I go. And then we do this. And then I get this big campaign and we launch it. And we're trying to hit, 10,000 users, within the first 75 days or whatever it might be. And we only got to 2,000. And the project I led failed, i.e. it did not meet the criteria of its stated outcome objective. That is a failure, and you failed to hit that target. We need to own that when you've got something at stake and it doesn't happen, it's costly, and the experience is called grief. So I think in the process of trying to get people to overcome unnecessary fear of failure, we start inadvertently judging people who are in the cost of working through the consequentiality. There is a consequence to something not happening as intended. So know when you're set up with very little or nothing at stake, and know when you've got something at stake, and both plan and process accordingly. That's thing one. And thing two, I'm going to do a double here. All the time I go through this conversation where something didn't work out. And I'll ask a whole room full of people, okay, when something doesn't work, when it fails, what's the first question you ask yourself? And 19 out of 20 people's first question is, what did I do wrong? And that's one of those very, very powerful questions, because it's a terrible question. That question believes two things. One is, if I had done everything right, it would have worked. Now, Dr. Grace, you teach at the LSE. If I do everything right, will it work?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily, because there are a whole lot of things over which you have no control whatsoever that have nothing to do with you did it right or wrong. That's thing one. So just because it didn't work doesn't mean anything was done wrong. And number two, what did I do wrong? Meaning, with hubris, I conclude I'm the center of the universe and my single action was the controlling outcome of the failure. So a much better question when something doesn't work out, which is implied in what Grace just said, I want to double down on that, is not what did I do wrong or what did we screw up? It's what happened. Just the objective question, including things over which we had no control whatsoever. And so is this just, as she said, luck, is it just a circumstance from which I move on? Or is there something to learn about? And very rarely, you actually can go back to your prior self, 19 months ago when you made that commitment and say, oh, yeah, my late 2021 person self, she screwed up. She should have done better. She mailed it in. She left it on the table. She didn't do homework that she could have done at the time. It is her fault. She could have done better. That is extremely rarely the case. Usually it's only my present self would know something better than my prior self did. And present selves are misjudging prior selves all the time. People, cut it out. We're all finite. We're learning on our way to go. Do objective analysis and learn appropriately, but stop beating yourself up for stuff you can't do.
Dave, what is the generational difference that you see? If you're talking to students, right, they are in the adulting phase of their life. They're kind of, wow, how can I find out about all this stuff? Oh, my goodness, I've got no experience, but here I go. Grizzled old men like you, Dave, know everything and have been through every experience in life. How do those stages happen?
Well, you actually asked two questions there. If you noticed which metaphors you were using, there's the season of life and there's the generation I'm in, and they're different. The season of life thing is real. First of all, you don't even have a neocortex until you're 27 or 28, a little later in men. Oh, what a surprise. So the whole judging, a lot of people sort of like, I really started to get my act together in my 30s. Yeah. What do you think? I mean, even people like the Buddha or Jesus don't even really show up until they're in their 30s. But so the season of life matters, and there are different experiences that are going on. And, late life is different than early life. And then there's the generation. So a boomer mindset is different than a Gen Z and, millennial. And those things are culturally mattering. And we deal with both. I would say right now, the fundamental existential questions about who am I and what does it mean to be a person? And is this working for me? Those questions persist. How I receive them at different seasons of life is a little bit different. Less different than you might imagine. The cultural differences are really significant. So the Gen Z generation, the first truly entirely digitally enabled generation on the planet Earth, coming in a post-COVID environment with the worst student anxiety and mental health in history. What they're suffering is very different than what boomers did when they were 20. So I think you need to be culturally sensitive, but at the end of the day, we are all still people, and the big questions are there, but they change with time.
Grace, can you take me through, as you say, Dave, period effects and cohort effects? So the notion of how do those things change through time? What have you seen in the work you've done?
So I think what has been really interesting in the work that I've done, and also if you kind of look at the kind of economic social science literature more broadly, is that, as Dave said, there's these kind of season effects. So as people get older, they change in their attitudes and they change in their beliefs. So we can see that across countries all over the world. So people will shift potentially from saying that they care less about money to caring more about money as financial pressure comes on, and then maybe a little bit less as they get older. We see people's political views changing. We see people's kind of wants from work changing and what they're willing to put up with within the culture. I think what's been really interesting about the COVID pandemic and the youngest cohort of workers now, so those basically somewhere between kind of 20 and 28, so spanning the kind of two generational labels, is their preferences seem to be much stickier than in the past. So I'm curious to see whether or not they will continue to adapt as maybe at a slower rate than before, or whether their preferences for particular types of work-life balance. The lie-down movement for me in China is really interesting, that people are saying, well, we're not interested in material wealth anymore, and we're willing to sacrifice to get that. We have quiet quitting in the UK, which is similar to that, but not having as much as large impact on firms. So I think what has been interesting, if we look across cohorts now, is for the first time, I think, when it comes to kind of beliefs and attitudes, they're not changing where we might expect with people aging, but they're sticky. So we have these kind of sticky preferences, pro-environment, sticky preferences for much more work-life balances as opposed to money. And yes, I have no idea whether or not that's going to stay or whether it's going to go over time.
This has been an amazing time having this conversation, listening to you. We talked about a successful, healthy life. Thank you so much for so many clever ways to think about who you are and your journey ahead and how to be successful. I would like, just to finish off, from each of you in turn to give our audience, give the people watching this, just one tool or one exercise that they can practice maybe, or do every day to help them center themselves and have that great chance at health, happiness, and success. Grace, could I come to you first?
I think on the exercise, because as human beings, we are loss averse, and we tend to be drawn much more to the losses that happen to us in our daily lives, in our week, as opposed to the things that we actually have. So, for example, if a colleague passes me today and they're incredibly rude to me, or they slight me, or they interrupt me in a meeting, that's going to weigh much more on me than a positive interaction that I can have with a colleague. And if we're thinking about happy lives, I think you need to consciously offset that through practicing gratitude. And if you're somebody who doesn't like to journal, this can be as simple as having an alarm on your phone at your 6 p.m. commute home, or at 6 p.m. when you put down your laptop and saying, bring me 5 things into my mind that I'm actually grateful for. And the way the human mind works is, if you don't do that, it will continue to be drawn to your losses and what's going wrong, which can make you quite miserable. But if you do it, And if you give your brain an instruction, you're kind of changing the narrative of your story. So even on the crummiest days, when things don't go right, maybe it's a prototype or maybe it's something that's even bigger for you, just kind of centering yourself and saying, here, give me 5 things that are going really well in this day and give me 5 more things that are going well in general is a good way to live a happy life.
Dave, can I come to you? But Grace, just to build on that very briefly, my executive coach said to me on the way home, Kamal, think about the 3 things that went well, not the 10 things that went badly. And I do stick to that.
Yeah, let me double down on that a little bit and actually give you sort of a granularity to sort of zoom in on it. One of the things we bump into all the time is one of the dysfunctions is there are a lot of dualities out there. Which we think are frankly, dysfunctional. So I got work-life balance, and I tend to think as a duality. If work goes up, life goes down. If life goes up, work goes down. So if you're in marketing, do I want market share or profitability? And we set up all these binary ways of thinking, many of which are false. And one of the classics is the being versus doing. Am I a human being or am I a human doing? And they treat me like a doing at the job, and we get into this being doing flip-flop thing. And our reframe on that is a generative cycle rather than a destructive competition in a teeter-totter, which is the being doing becoming. So if you define a human being as a becoming, we're going to grow, we're going to get better. If I'm going to get better, I was worse, by the way. I have to have been worse yesterday in order to get better tomorrow. That's built in. Then my question simply is, how am I fueling my becoming? And that becoming, I want to be, correlated to, so I start with who I really am, my being, and then I go out in the world and do stuff, but I'm trying to learn from what I'm doing and experience things that are expressions of my authentic self. And that's a becoming, and then my becoming progresses and my being upgrades, and around we go in a nice virtuous circle rather than a vicious cycle. And so the exercise would be, because there is no such, you can't do the ultimate ever. You can't say, let's go do beauty. What do you mean? Well, I can make a beautiful cup of coffee, but I can't just do beauty. Let's do justice. I need to do justice. Well, I could do something justly. So philosophically, this is called the scandal of particularity. It turns out the ultimate is only expressed in the ridiculous. So there's no such thing as I was entirely myself today. That doesn't exist. So you look back on that, you do that gratefulness thing, but now what you're doing, you do a particular lens. I'm looking for when today did I actually have an opportunity to express or do or act out or collaborate in something that mattered to me? So like being a collaborator really mattered to me today. So, when I asked that one more question on our team meeting, and then Grace showed up with that idea, which was not in her normal area of expertise. She shared something about the way we write, and she's normally a process person, and then I saw her smile. And so I helped real collaboration occur today, and that's who I want to be in the world. I feel great about that. Not just, it was really cool when Grace shared that thing, but because that's an expression of my value set. So you get good at daily looking for those little moments. They're little moments, particular moments, when an authentic version of you got a chance to show up in the world for a couple of minutes or have an impact or have a participation. That's when you're experiencing authenticity or coherency, and celebrate that. So the suggestion is find those moments, return to them in your mind, savor, because they go by in a heartbeat, and savor them, and that will animate the real you, and that will help catalyze your becoming into your authentic self incrementally, slowly but surely, over time. So look for places you got to show up in a meaningful way and celebrate them.
Grace and Dave, what a lovely place to end.